Have you ever pondered why authentication and authorization hold such significance in the realm of information security? Well, let's dive into that. In the vast digital landscape, authentication is the process that verifies the identity of a user, device, or system. It's like a bouncer at a nightclub, checking IDs to ensure only legit partygoers get in. Authorization, on the other hand, determines what services, resources, or information the authenticated user or system is permitted to access. Think of it as the club manager who decides who gets to the VIP section. Together, authentication and authorization form a powerful duo, safeguarding the right individuals have access to the right resources at the right times for the right reasons. They stand as the gatekeepers in information security, protecting our data from misuse or theft. Without these crucial processes, your data could fall into the wrong hands, leading to potentially disastrous consequences. To start, we must first comprehend what authentication is. In the realm of information security, authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user, device, or system. It's like the bouncer at a club, checking IDs to ensure only the right people get in. But how does it work? Well, imagine you're trying to log into your email account. You input your username and password. The system then checks these credentials against its records. If they match, you're in. If not, access is denied. That, in its simplest form, is authentication. Now, passwords are the most common method of authentication, and we've all used them, but they're not the only way. There's also biometric scans, which use unique physical or behavioral traits, such as fingerprints or facial patterns, to verify identity. It's like a high-tech version of a signature or a seal, something that's uniquely yours and hard to replicate. Then there's two-factor authentication, or 2FA. This method adds an extra layer of security by combining two different types of identification. For example, something you know, like a password, with something you have, like a mobile device to receive a one-time code. It's like using two keys to open a safe, making it twice as hard for intruders to gain access. So, in essence, authentication is your first line of defense in protecting your data. It's the gatekeeper, verifying who's allowed in and who's not, guarding your information from those who shouldn't have access. Now that we know what authentication is, let's dive into authorization. Think of authorization as the gatekeeper that decides what you're allowed to do once you've been identified. So while authentication is about verifying who you are, authorization is all about determining what you can access or do. Imagine you're at a music festival. Your ticket, which you've already authenticated by showing at the entrance, gets you into the venue. But not all areas of the festival are open to everyone, right? Some areas are restricted to VIP ticket holders or artists only. This is where authorization comes into play. It's like the security guard who checks your wristband to see if you're allowed into the VIP area or backstage. In the digital world, this translates to role-based access control, a common method of authorization. In this model, permissions aren't granted to specific users, but rather to defined roles within an organization. For instance, an HR manager might have access to employee records, while a sales manager wouldn't. The goal of authorization is to implement the principle of least privilege. This means that users should only have access to the resources they need to perform their duties, and nothing more. This approach minimizes the potential damage that could result from an accident, error, or security breach. Thus, while authentication confirms who you are, authorization decides what you can do. Understanding these concepts is one thing, but how do you go about implementing authentication and authorization technologies? Diving right in, the first step is defining user roles. It's vital to identify who will be using your system and what they'll be doing. This could range from administrators with full access to standard users with limited permissions, or even guests who can only view content. By mapping out these roles, you lay the groundwork for the rest of your security plan. Next up, choosing an authentication method. This is how your users will prove their identities. Will you use passwords, biometrics, or two-factor authentication? The choice depends on your security needs and the nature of your user base. Remember, the goal here is to balance security with user convenience. Once you've chosen an authentication method, it's time to set up role-based access controls. This is where you define what each role can and cannot do within your system. For example, an administrator might have the ability to create new accounts, while a standard user might only be able to view and edit their own account. The key here is to grant the least amount of privilege necessary for each role to complete their tasks. This principle, known as least privilege, reduces the risk of unauthorized access and minimizes potential damage. And lastly, it's crucial to remember that implementing these technologies is not a one-time task. Regularly review and update your settings to respond to changes in user roles, threats, and technology. For instance, if you introduce a new feature, you'll need to decide who can access it and how they'll authenticate themselves. Or if a new threat emerges, you might need to tighten your security controls. So as you can see, implementing these technologies requires careful planning and regular maintenance. It's a continuous process that evolves with your system and the wider security landscape. It's not always easy, but the peace of mind knowing your data is safe is definitely worth the effort. Before we wrap up, here are some key points to remember about implementing authentication and authorization technologies. These processes are crucial in information security, ensuring the right individuals have access to the appropriate data. Authentication verifies the identity of the user. It's like asking, "Who are you?" and expecting a valid response. It's the first line of defense against unauthorized access. On the other hand, authorization comes after authentication. It's like asking, "What can you do?" It determines the actions and resources a verified user can access. It's your second line of defense, ensuring users only access the information they're permitted to. Implementing these technologies involves careful planning and execution. It often includes password systems, biometrics, two-factor authentication, and access control lists. Remember, in the world of information security, authentication and authorization are your gatekeepers. They ensure that your data remains in the right hands.